Imagine you stand in a churned, freezing lane in March, AD 1461. The Yorkshire mud sucks violently at your soaked leather boots, trying to pull you down into the earth before the battle even begins. Your throat feels completely raw, scraped clean by days of relentless marching through freezing rain. You look down at your hands. The skin splits over your knuckles, cracked and bleeding from a bitter, biting cold that never fully leaves your flesh. You rub your freezing fingers together, desperately trying to summon warmth, but the wet, coarse wool of your gloves offers nothing but friction. Suddenly, a scout's rider hammers closer down the rutted track. His warhorse screams, blowing violent plumes of steam into the frigid air, flanks lathered in white foam and dark mud. The message he carries lands in the ranks like a physical blow. The North rises, the crown shakes, and today the central question is no longer mere survival. The question is whose name you are legally allowed to say out loud. Henry of Lancaster, Edward of York. Say the wrong name in the wrong ear, and the very road you stand on becomes an immediate gallows. You watch the men around you try to pretend this is a normal campaign. They fail miserably. A forced laugh starts in a throat, dies instantly, and turns into a hacking cough. Beside you, an older man pins a cloth badge to his torn, padded jack with fingers that absolutely will not stop shaking. The captain's voice cracks like a whip, snapping orders down the line, forcing bodies to move long before tired minds can catch up. You step into a defensive formation that feels entirely too thin for the open ground. Someone behind you whispers that the enemy forces outnumber you 2-1. Someone else fiercely swears the enemy army is starving, freezing, and ready to break at the first charge. You stare straight ahead, wondering which lie will kill you first. A camp priest quickly mutters Latin words meant to make spilled blood feel holy, but the syllables slide uselessly off the hard armor of fear building in your chest. You feel the heavy, awkward weight of the polearm in your calloused hands. The ashwood remains damp and slick. The forged iron blade feels cold enough to sting bare skin. You smell the overwhelming stench of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and old wood smoke clinging to every man like a heavy second cloak. The normal world completely shatters right here. Peace is no longer a recognizable concept. Law offers zero shelter. The only thing that matters today is which army's story survives, because the winning story immediately writes the word traitor on the severed necks of the losers. The looming threat arrives as a deep, rumbling sound long before it becomes a sight. War horns blast somewhere out in the blinding white fog. You hear the rhythmic clacking of thousands of iron plates, the snapping of wooden shafts, and the low, terrifying animal roar of a massive army moving as a single, devastating body. You glance at your captain. You see his eyes widen, but the look he wears is not blind panic. It is cold, hard calculation. He stares intensely past you, past the shivering line of spearmen, as if staring directly into the brutal future. You realize with a sudden chill that this is not merely a battle over territory. This is a final, bloody verdict that decides exactly what England will call legitimate for the next century. The brutal march begins again simply because stopping means freezing to death in the mud. The broken road itself actively tries to murder your column. Supply lines collapse. Rations shrink to nothing. Therefore, hunger becomes a constant, gnawing ache that violently turns every coherent thought into a blunt instrument of survival. You desperately chew on rock-hard bread that tastes of dust, mold, and old storage barrels. You suck the cold, hardened fat from a rancid strip of salted meat, not because it tastes good, but because it functions as raw fuel and your shivering body violently demands payment. Your mouth constantly tastes of salt, old smoke, and a metallic fear that no amount of water ever rinses out. You watch heavy supply wagons bog down deep in the frozen ruts. The wooden wheels sink furiously into the mire as if the earth swallows them whole. Men heave against the heavy oak frames, violently cursing, slipping on the slick mud, tearing their fingernails. A thick hemp rope suddenly snaps under the immense tension. Therefore, a massive cart sharply tilts and heavily spills what little precious cargo remains. Bundles of arrows scatter into the muck. Sacks of grain burst open. A few battered iron cooking pots roll away. Nobody cheers when the quartermasters finally recover the mess. Hands just move incredibly fast, completely desperate, because absolutely everybody in this freezing column understands the exact same brutal equation. No food means no fight. No fight means no future. Night brutally descends, but the darkness offers zero rest. You huddle miserably in a thin, pathetic shelter made of branches that completely fails to block the howling wind. Therefore, sleep only arrives in shattered, broken pieces. Your heavy eyes close for a few desperate seconds, only to snap open at the sound of snapping twigs or distant coughing. You hear poisonous rumors crawl through the freezing camp like diseased rats. Some terrified men whisper the enemy numbers 10,000 strong. Others violently argue it is 20,000. Others claim the enemy brings more men than can physically fit on the Yorkshire fields. Nobody can accurately count a moving army through blinding snow and blinding fear. Forward scouts stagger back into camp with pinched, frostbitten faces, spitting out troop numbers that completely contradict each other. Therefore, absolute certainty becomes entirely impossible. You endure officers shouting that the enemy vanguard is close. Then an hour later, closer. Then a breathless rider screams they are right there. The panicked words change every single hour. Therefore, your stomach violently churns and never settles. Your freezing hands compulsively keep checking the leather straps of your armor, checking the tight knots on your boots, checking the razor edge on your iron blade as if sharpening steel can magically fix the future. You feel a burning ache deep in your shoulders from carrying heavy gear, but the deeper, darker ache resides in your mind from simply not knowing if you will live to see Monday. Savage violence erupts long before you ever reach the main field. It always does. A sudden, vicious rage snaps out of the white fog like a starving wolf breaking violently from the brush. A sudden shout pierces the air. A horrific clash of steel violently rings out. A man standing directly to your left goes down hard in the freezing mire near a river crossing, violently dragged backward by unseen hands you cannot clearly track in the chaos. Somebody desperately stabs downward into the mud. Once, twice, 3 times, until the frantic splashing and struggling abruptly stops. The brutal lesson arrives hard and fast. Medieval wars are never lost solely in grand, sweeping collisions of armies. They are lost in the terrifying, chaotic hours before, when extreme exhaustion critically slows your hands and makes your freezing mind incredibly stupid. Therefore, military discipline turns violently cruel to keep the army intact. An officer's thick wooden stick violently cracks across a freezing man's back just to keep the marching line moving forward. A starving man who stumbles and falls out of step receives absolutely no comfort. He gets brutally shoved, viciously kicked, and violently hauled up by his filthy collar, because a straggler quickly becomes a frozen corpse, and a frozen corpse instantly becomes a demoralizing warning to the rest. You watch a young boy, entirely too young for this hell, his freezing cheeks still soft and round, desperately try to hide his violently shaking hands inside his torn woolen sleeves. The torn sleeves do absolutely nothing to hide his terror. You feel a sudden flash of anger at his weakness, then an immediate wave of crushing shame, because you know the violent shaking is not cowardice. It is pure, unfiltered honesty. Fierce political propaganda slowly infects the men right alongside the shrinking rations. Your commanders angrily call the other side treasonous oathbreakers, vile thieves of the realm, and tools of the devil. The enemies across the snow angrily call your side illegitimate usurpers, blasphemous murderers, and destroyers of rightful royal blood. These sharp, polished words are explicitly designed to make the messy act of killing feel clean and justified. Therefore, exhausted men loudly repeat these slogans because they desperately need something pure to hold on to. But the cold iron of your dagger absolutely does not care what the royal sermon says. Forged steel completely ignores all desperate prayers. When a blade violently enters soft flesh, that flesh tears open and aggressively bleeds out the exact same way, regardless of which nobleman's colorful banner loudly snaps in the wind above. Then the sun rises on Palm Sunday, and the morning feels absolutely nothing like a holy day of peace. Imagine you finally step onto the massive, sprawling field of Towton in AD 1461, and a sudden, violent blizzard instantly turns the entire world into a blinding white corridor with absolutely no walls. You look down and realize the ground under the accumulating snow is not flat or smooth. It is violently churned, rutted, and frozen solid. Therefore, every single step aggressively threatens to steal your balance and snap your ankles. You peer forward. The massive enemy line appears only as a dark, menacing bruise in the far distance, sometimes vaguely visible, sometimes completely swallowed by the howling white storm as if the army never existed at all. You finally hear the first harsh commands carry through the roaring white wind. The exact words are completely lost in the gale, but the lethal meaning remains crystal clear because thousands of bodies instantly respond the exact same way. the masked archers suddenly raise their heavy yew bows. Thousands of thick hemp strings loudly creak under immense tension. Arrows violently get yanked from leather quivers. Men quickly spit into their freezing palms because their numb fingers absolutely must grip the wood. You stand rigidly in the infantry ranks directly behind them, positioned close enough to acutely smell the beeswax on their bowstrings and the foul odor of their wet leather armor. You feel extreme tension violently gather and coil up like a tightly drawn bowstring inside your own shivering ribs. The decisive, horrifying minute arrives without any grand ceremony. The massive line steadies itself. A screaming order sharply cuts through the howling wind. You watch the archers draw the heavy strings back until their shoulders burn, their back muscles violently screaming under damp, freezing cloth. Loose, thousands of arrows instantly vanish into the blinding white storm. For half a breathless second, it completely feels like nothing happens, like the immense physical strength of the army just gets foolishly thrown away into empty space. Therefore, terrible doubt immediately flares in your mind. Did the captains misjudge the distance? Is the violent wind entirely wrong? Is everything about this attack a massive mistake? Then, the howling wind brutally reveals its true allegiance. It fiercely blows directly into your face. Suddenly, a massive, dark cloud of arrows comes rushing back out of the whiteout directly at you. Vastly more arrows than your side just sent, viciously hissing like angry hornets, violently thudding into the frozen ground, powerfully punching through thick leather, shattering wooden shields and tearing into soft faces. You watch a man standing directly in front of you violently jerk backward as if abruptly yanked by an invisible, massive rope. He slowly looks down, his eyes wide and completely confused, as a thick, black-fletched arrow stands rigidly protruding from his bleeding throat like a dark twig planted in soil. His mouth drops open to scream, but only a wet, sickening, gargling sound escapes his lips. He slowly folds at the knees, heavily crashing into the bloody snow. Therefore, you instantly understand how time can horrifically stretch and slow down in moments of pure terror. Another heavy bodkin arrow instantly takes a screaming man straight through the left eye. He drops straight down into the slush without making a single noise, exactly like a wooden puppet whose strings just got violently slashed. The enemy archers aggressively shift their aim, and therefore, the freezing sky violently fills with dark wood again. Loose, loose, loose. The devastating rhythm instantly becomes a horrific, unstoppable machine of death. Massive snowflakes violently swirl between the falling wooden shafts, making the freezing air look incredibly thick. Therefore, tracking every single incoming hiss becomes completely impossible. You hear the loud, cracking slap of iron arrowheads violently burying themselves into wooden shields. You hear the much deeper, wetter, infinitely worse sound, heavy steel punching deep into human meat. Men all around you begin violently screaming terrible, high-pitched words that do not even sound like human words anymore. Standing still in the storm means dying. Therefore, the desperate order finally screams out to advance. You violently stumble forward, lowering your head into the blizzard, because your boots sink deep and the treacherous snow cleverly hides sucking mud that grabs your ankles like frozen hands. You watch men accidentally step on thousands of fallen arrows, violently snapping the shafts under heavy boots. They are the lucky ones because a violently snapped arrow is merely broken wood. An unbroken, upright shaft hidden in the snow can violently pin a man's foot directly to the earth, instantly turning him into a screaming, stationary target for the next vicious volley. The terrifying distance rapidly closes. The bruised shadow of the enemy line aggressively grows from a dark smear into a towering, solid wall of armored men. You suddenly see sharp, horrifying shapes emerging from the whiteout. Gleaming helmets, hooked bills, massive poleaxes, looking dark, wet, and lethal against the pristine snow. Your freezing breath comes in hard, ragged gasps, and every single desperate inhale heavily tastes of cold iron and raw panic. You feel your tight grip violently clamp down on your weapon's shaft until your knuckles scream in pain. Therefore, you barely even notice the freezing numbness in your fingers anymore. The first brutal contact is absolutely not heroic. It is a horrific, ugly display of violent physics. Sharp steel bills violently hook onto plate armor. Heavy poleaxes brutally bite into wooden shields and skulls. Sweating bodies violently shove into other bodies in a terrifying crush so impossibly tight that you physically cannot swing your weapon. You can only frantically stab, violently push, desperately breathe, and fight like a madman to avoid falling down. You violently slam shoulder to shoulder with terrified strangers who are suddenly pressed closer to you than lifelong lovers. You completely lose sight of the sky. You entirely lose your sense of time. This brutal battle strictly measures itself entirely by violent physical sensations. A bone-rattling shock violently runs straight up your right arm when your iron blade brutally meets an enemy's collarbone. Your wrist violently jars from the intense impact. Therefore, white-hot pain instantly blooms up to your elbow, but you absolutely cannot stop moving. You acutely smell the hot, stinking breath of a screaming man pressing into your face who is absolutely not your friend, but not quite yet your killer. You violently taste copper and freezing mud when a massive shove from the rear ranks brutally drives your face down dangerously near the trampled, bloody ground. A desperate man viciously swings a heavy blade directly at your head. You barely even see the steel flash. You only feel it, a sudden violent jolt crashing into your forearm as your wooden shaft desperately catches his descending weapon just in time. Therefore, you violently shove your weight forward, aggressively using the immense, crushing pressure of the men behind you as your own physical force. Your iron point violently finds something soft under his armor. It aggressively enters his stomach with a sudden, sickening give. The screaming man's eyes violently widen, as if he understands a profound secret just a second too late. He makes a horrifying noise exactly like violently crushed bellows expelling air, then abruptly slumps forward. But the dead body absolutely does not fall cleanly to the ground. The crushing pressure violently wedges his corpse upright. The dead man literally becomes a structural part of the screaming, pushing wall of meat. Somewhere to your far right, a ragged cheer violently rises up, but it sounds incredibly thin, desperate, and completely uncertain. Somewhere to your immediate left, terrible screams aggressively build up into a terrifying, continuous wave of sheer panic. You absolutely do not know if your chosen king is currently winning the battle, violently bleeding out in the snow, or already a trampled corpse. You only know that the immense physical pressure pressing against your chest fiercely increases, then suddenly wavers, exactly like a heavy wooden door aggressively splintering and beginning to give way. The heavy snow relentlessly keeps falling. Therefore, the spreading blood rapidly turns dark, thick, and incredibly strange against the pristine white flakes, looking almost pitch black. The footing quickly becomes absolute treachery. You feel your left boot violently slide out from under you on something incredibly slick. You desperately look down and realize it is absolutely not just mud. It is a horrifying, freezing slurry of churned mud, spilled intestines, freezing blood, and violently trampled cloth. A dead, armored hand rigidly sticks out of a red snowdrift, frozen fingers completely locked in a desperate grasp. Therefore, the freezing field itself completely looks like it aggressively tries to reach up and pull the living down into the earth. The horrific crush violently tightens again. The pressure is so immense you physically cannot lift your weapon higher than your waist. Therefore, you desperately resort to stabbing low, viciously thrusting under exposed ribs, violently driving steel into unprotected bellies, slashing wildly at armored thighs. The screaming enemy fiercely does the exact same thing to you. You suddenly feel a massive, glancing blow violently smash into your left shoulder, and a blinding flash of heat violently rips through your entire body. It is absolutely not the pleasant heat from sudden warmth. It is the terrifying, burning heat from a sudden violent injury. Heavy cloth violently tears open. Freezing skin violently parts. Your ragged breath sharply catches in your throat. Therefore, raw fear violently tries to turn your trembling legs into useless water, but there is absolutely no room to run away. There is only the violent pressure forward and the immense, crushing weight of thousands of screaming men pushing from behind. You loudly hear your own side desperately shouting royal names. Edward, a York, a York! Screaming the name exactly like the syllables themselves form a magical, impenetrable shield. The opposing line violently shouts a completely different royal name back in your face. Therefore, the freezing air aggressively transforms into a deadly, screaming contest of political syllables. Those very syllables directly push sharp steel deep into soft flesh. A severely wounded man pressed closely near you finally goes down. He absolutely does not fall backward. He violently sinks straight down exactly where he stands. Therefore, the exhausted men pushing directly behind him violently trip over his armored body. A terrifying, screaming pile of humans rapidly forms in the mud. The pile instantly becomes a lethal trap. You watch heavy boots violently kicking, desperate men frantically trying to climb out of the crushing weight. You hear terrible, muffled cries as broken faces get violently pressed deep into the bloody, freezing slush. Somebody desperately tries to crawl away on their belly, but a heavy iron-shod foot violently stamps down directly on their neck, perhaps by accident in the blinding chaos, perhaps entirely on purpose. The muffled crying instantly stops. The suffocating fog of war violently thickens. The driving snow completely blinds you. Your heavy, ragged breath instantly fogs your vision. If you wear a visor, the frozen steel narrows your entire world to tiny, bloody slits. Therefore, you violently fight the nearest dark shape, wildly striking at the nearest sudden movement. Friend and foe completely blur together into a singular, terrifying mass when padded coats are violently torn to shreds and colorful royal badges are completely hidden under thick layers of freezing grime and dark blood. You briefly hear someone desperately scream for mercy through the howling wind. The terrified voice sounds incredibly young. It easily might be your own voice on any other given day. But the massive, churning crush completely ignores all pleas for mercy. Therefore, the desperate voice quickly gets violently swallowed by the roar of the slaughter. Time aggressively collapses into an endless, agonizing loop of violent effort. Push hard. Stab deep. Violently pull the blade back. Push hard again. Your screaming shoulders violently burn with lactic acid. Your bleeding hands violently cramp around the wooden shaft. Your freezing mouth completely dries out. Therefore, you desperately lick your cracked, freezing lips and violently taste warm blood, and you absolutely cannot tell if it is your own blood or the blood of the man you just murdered. A desperate man violently lunges at you, and his sharp blade aggressively slides between two tightly packed bodies. The steel violently hits a man's rib, harshly scrapes against the bone, then brutally bites deep. You feel a sudden, sharp sting aggressively slice along your own side. You violently gasp in shock. The screaming man desperately tries to wrench his embedded weapon free, but the crushing weight of bodies violently jams the steel in place. Therefore, he completely abandons the weapon in terror and frantically reaches down for another blade dropped in the mud. Somewhere deep in the blinding whiteout, a massive royal banner violently dips toward the mud. You absolutely cannot see which side it belongs to. Therefore, pure, unfiltered panic instantly ripples through the freezing ranks exactly like a highly contagious disease. Terrified men frantically shout completely contradictory orders. Hold the line. Push forward. Fall back. Each desperate command violently collides with the next. Your exhausted captain screams himself completely hoarse, frantically trying to keep the defensive shape intact. Therefore, he literally uses his own armored body as a physical wall, violently shoving men's shoulders, brutally slamming fleeing men back into the meat grinder. Then, something massive aggressively shifts in the horrific crush, something you can viscerally feel deep in your aching bones. The immense physical pressure pushing from the enemy line absolutely does not increase this time. It suddenly softens. It visibly hesitates. It feels exactly like thousands of knees simultaneously bending in exhaustion. It feels exactly like courage violently draining out of a punctured wound. You stare directly at the bloody faces across from you, watching terrified eyes frantically darting around, watching mouths gaping wide open for freezing breath that absolutely does not arrive fast enough. Their solid, unbroken line aggressively begins to ripple and bow backward. But that sudden ripple absolutely does not mean safety for you. It means a violent structural change. Therefore, the horrific killing instantly accelerates into a frenzy. Men on your side who violently sense this sudden advantage begin fighting exactly like desperate, drowning swimmers fighting for air. They aggressively climb directly over the piles of dead bodies, swinging their weapons substantially harder, stabbing significantly deeper into the retreating mass. You watch a terrified enemy soldier get brutally hooked under the armpit by a sharp billhook. He gets violently yanked forward out of the safety of the pack. His heavy boots completely leave the ground. He screams in absolute terror as he is violently pulled directly into the waiting blades of the crush. Therefore, his expensive, heavy armor does absolutely nothing but make him too heavy to escape. You viscerally feel the exact, terrifying moment when the solid enemy line is no longer a structured wall. It violently degrades into a panicked crowd. A chaotic crowd instantly breaks down into terrified individuals, and terrified individuals can violently break. The massive Lancaster line finally breaks, absolutely not with a formal, dignified trumpet blast, but with a sudden, violent tremor of sheer panic. A massive gap violently tears open in the formation. Screaming men in the very front ranks finally turn their unprotected backs to you. For one fleeting, exhausted second, you desperately think, Thank God. It is finally over. Then, brutal understanding violently crashes over you like a bucket of ice water. The battle is not over. The killing simply changes its shape from a fight into a slaughter. A medieval rout is absolutely never about mercy. It is a savage, bloodthirsty hunt. Therefore, the entire organized field violently spills over into thousands of men frantically running, violently slipping, and screaming in the bloody snow. You aggressively chase them because the crushing weight of the bodies pushing behind you violently forces you forward, and because stopping now absolutely means being brutally trampled to death by your own advancing side. You watch terrified men violently throw down their heavy weapons just to run a fraction faster. You watch expensive, protective helmets get desperately discarded into the mud because they violently choke a runner's vision and breath. But discarding armor instantly becomes a fatal curse when the freezing ground violently turns to a sucking mire. The heavy snow completely hides a swollen, freezing watercourse known as cockbeck until a fleeing man's boot violently finds the edge. A terrified man running just ahead of you violently plunges down the hidden bank, freezing, dark water instantly rushing up to his knees. He desperately tries to claw his way up the opposite muddy bank, but the immense weight of his soaked armor violently drags him back down. Therefore, he frantically flails his arms exactly like a drowning insect trapped in heavy sap. Another terrified runner violently crashes directly into his back. Then another, then 5 more. The muddy bank violently collapses under the sudden, immense weight. You loudly hear a sudden, horrific chorus of desperate screams as dozens of armored men violently pile on top of each other into the narrow, freezing stream, their heavy bodies inextricably wedging together, the freezing, dark water violently forcing its way into open, screaming mouths. You stand on the muddy bank and watch a freezing, armored hand violently reach up from the black water, desperately grasping at absolutely nothing. Frantic fingers aggressively claw the freezing air, then violently slip back under the churning surface. A terrified face suddenly appears gasping for air, eyes wide and completely wild with panic, then instantly disappears under the crushing weight of another falling man. You desperately want to look away from the horror, but you physically cannot move your head. The brutal sight permanently pins itself deep into your mind. Therefore, the sweet taste of victory instantly turns completely bitter and sick in your throat. Some of the exhausted, fleeing men violently drop to their knees in the bloody mud and loudly beg for quarter. Some aggressively curse their fleeing lords. Some weep and frantically pray to God. But the adrenaline-fueled chase absolutely does not stop to listen to prayers. A screaming man running near you viciously swings his heavy poleaxe down hard onto a kneeling man's unprotected back. The massive blow violently lands with a sickening sound exactly like a heavy axe striking wet, rotten wood. The screaming runner instantly drops dead into the slush. Another chasing man violently steps directly over the twitching corpse without breaking stride. Therefore, the fallen dead instantly become nothing more than slippery stepping stones for the living. You finally feel your own legs violently shaking from absolute, total exhaustion, but the raw adrenaline relentlessly lashes you forward like a whip. Your freezing lungs violently burn with cold air. Your freshly wounded shoulder aggressively throbs with searing pain with every single heavy stride you take. Therefore, every single physical motion you make is absolute agony. But the pain rapidly becomes background noise because your sheer, animal survival violently demands complete, unbroken focus. The heavy snow stubbornly continues to fall, desperately trying to blanket and hide the horrific evidence of the slaughter. It absolutely cannot. Not today. 28,000 dead bodies brutally lie scattered in the massive red drifts exactly like dropped, broken bundles of trash. Thousands of broken wooden arrows stand rigidly planted in the bloody field exactly like a terrifying crop of black grass. A painted wooden shield violently splits open, brightly showing the pale, raw wood inside exactly like shattered human bone. You stare down and see a young man's face half buried in the freezing slush, his mouth frozen wide open and completely packed with red snow. His dead, glassy eyes stare completely blankly at the howling sky. Therefore, the freezing dead all look incredibly surprised by their sudden violent end. The deafening roar of the battle finally fades away into much smaller, infinitely worse sounds. The quiet sobbing of broken men, the ragged coughing of the dying, the wet, horrific gargle of someone violently bleeding out into their own lungs but not fully gone yet. You force yourself to step incredibly carefully now, because the slippery footing is absolute treachery with thousands of tangled corpses hidden just under the fresh snow. Your heavy boot violently catches on a dead man's leather strap, and you nearly pitch forward face first into the bloody slush. Therefore, you completely understand that this cursed field still violently tries to kill you even after the main fight is officially over. Somewhere far behind you, a high-ranking lord's booming voice loudly declares a glorious victory. Somewhere, a fast messenger frantically saddles a fresh horse to aggressively carry the news back to London in a single, polished, completely clean sentence. That royal sentence is incredibly simple. God deeply favors the rightful winner. The shattered realm finally has a true king. Divine justice is gloriously done. But you stand freezing entirely inside the raw, bleeding truth, and the absolute truth is absolutely not clean. Tomorrow, someone wearing expensive silk will loudly call this horrific slaughter a glorious victory, a divine judgment, or the restoration of the rightful order. The brutal story rapidly gets aggressively polished by scribes until it shines like fake gold. Therefore, the thousands of dead men violently freezing in the mud instantly become neat political symbols instead of remaining actual sons, husbands, fathers, or terrified boys with violently shaking hands. You are the ultimate witness. You stand in the mud and know exactly what the official royal propaganda absolutely cannot fully erase. The sickening, gurgling sound of men actively drowning under the weight of their own armor, the profound, empty look in a dying man's eyes when he finally realizes his colorful royal banner absolutely does not matter to the freezing mud. You viscerally feel it deep in your aching bones. This spectacular battle is nothing more than a horrific butcher's bill, violently paid in full by thousands of ordinary people who absolutely never get to vote for a royal dynasty. As the bloody day finally collapses into a freezing, gray evening, the bitter cold violently returns to aggressively claim whatever warmth the adrenaline briefly borrowed. You feel the violent shaking start deep in your exhausted legs and rapidly climb straight up into your bleeding hands. Therefore, you absolutely cannot hold your heavy weapon steady anymore. You violently lean your entire body weight on it, exactly like an old man leaning on a walking staff. You suddenly taste warm blood on your cracked lips again, and you absolutely cannot tell whose blood you just swallowed. The exhausted, traumatized survivors slowly gather together in small, freezing clumps, blankly staring at each other with hollow, haunted faces that absolutely do not match their true age anymore. Somebody desperately tries to laugh to break the silence. One sharp, forced bark of sound, but therefore, the laugh instantly breaks and violently becomes a ragged, weeping sob. A completely exhausted man heavily kneels in the mud and desperately digs at the freezing, bloody snow with his bare, freezing fingers, frantically trying to uncover the face of a missing friend. His cracked fingernails violently tear and bleed. He desperately keeps digging anyway. You watch exhausted camp priests slowly moving among the thousands of bodies, rapidly murmuring rapid Latin prayers with voices that violently crack from the cold. But even holy prayers rapidly become cold, brutal logistics. The officers rapidly decide who gets buried first, who violently gets stripped of their expensive armor to fund the next campaign, who gets completely left to rot because the frozen ground is simply too hard to dig mass graves today. Therefore, basic human mercy instantly becomes a tightly rationed military resource. In the freezing distance, a few torn royal banners still proudly stand in the wind, but they look incredibly small now, vastly less like symbols of divine destiny and substantially more like cheap, torn cloth tied to wooden poles. The freezing field absolutely does not care what brilliant royal colors fly above it. The field cares absolutely only about dead weight, freezing water, biting cold, and the simple, brutal fact that human flesh easily breaks. Now the final royal verdict arrives, absolutely not in a loud, golden proclamation, but in the terrifying, quiet math of absolute absence. The true cost of the crown is violently counted in the empty, freezing spaces standing around the campfires, in the shouted names that absolutely do not answer the roll call, in the empty boots that sit silently beside a dead man and absolutely never move again. Therefore, the kingdom violently gains a slightly clearer line of political succession, but the ordinary people violently pay for it with a heavy, traumatic silence that strictly lasts for decades. The specific political story that violently wins the field today aggressively hardens into absolute law tomorrow. It aggressively prints itself in heavy wax seals, forced oaths of loyalty, royal pardons, and brutal executions. It loudly tells everyone in the kingdom exactly what is now considered true. Therefore, many exhausted people simply accept the violent lie, because complete exhaustion always desperately loves simple certainty. The shattered world desperately craves a single unchallenged royal name just to completely steady its violently shaking hands. But do you clearly see what actually decides the ultimate fate of England standing here in the bloody snow? It is absolutely not only the sharpness of the steel. It is absolutely not only the bravery of the dying men. It is the absolute control of legitimacy, the violent control of deciding exactly which horrific acts of violence legally count as divine justice. Step entirely out of the freezing hell of AD 1461, and the terrifying, bloody snowfield still violently clings to your mind. The brutal historical lesson burns bright and hot. Aggressively control the narrative story, and almost any violent tyrant can easily wear a golden crown. Therefore, ambitious leaders always fight their wars twice, once violently with sharp steel blades, and once aggressively with polished words that forcefully tell the traumatized survivors exactly what they are legally supposed to feel about the blades that just slaughtered their friends. You clearly see the exact same terrifying pattern repeat itself whenever societal fear violently rises and screaming factions aggressively demand a single, approved name, a single, aggressively approved version of complex events. You viscerally feel the intense social pressure that violently pushes completely ordinary people into committing irreversible, brutal acts, only to immediately offer them a highly comforting, sanitized sentence afterward. It absolutely had to happen. Therefore, personal, moral responsibility completely gets violently dissolved into catchy, repeated political slogans. So here stands the brutal, unflinching mirror of history. When basic information violently turns into a weapon and basic loyalty instantly becomes a literal test at the point of a sword. Forcefully say this name, violently denounce that one. Exactly how quickly does a peaceful community completely stop being neighbors and violently start being a bloody battlefield? When the political story aggressively demands oceans of blood just to prove itself true, exactly who truly benefits from the horrific proof? And here stands the ultimate legacy question. The profound question absolutely no polished royal chronicle ever answers for you. Imagine you aggressively stand once again directly on that freezing white corridor with absolutely no walls, the howling storm violently swallowing the distance, the next brutal kill order already forming on the captain's lips. You look down and see a cheap cloth badge aggressively pinned in your freezing palm. You physically feel the heavy, expecting eyes of your own side staring directly at you, aggressively waiting to hear you shout the correct royal name. When the shining crown is ultimately nothing more than a violent story that aggressively asks you to kill your neighbors, what do you finally choose to protect, your temporary physical safety, your desperate sense of belonging, or your immortal soul?